In a coastal village where judgment flows as freely as the tide, Eleanor Hartwell has endured years of cruel whispers about her unmarried state and supposed unfitness for motherhood. The townspeople have made her an outcast, convinced that a spinster could never understand a child's heart. Their mockery has shaped her quiet existence on the village's edge, where she tends her garden in solitude. Everything changes when Captain Marcus Blackthorne, a feared pirate, arrives unexpectedly with two frightened orphans he rescued from a shipwreck. When the villagers resume their sneering comments about Eleanor, the hardened seafarer silences them with words that will reshape all their lives. But what dangerous secret about the children's past will force this unlikely family to fight for survival? Eleanor retreated to her cottage as the crowd dispersed, Captain Blackthorne's words still echoing in her mind. Her small home sat at the village's edge, surrounded by gardens that had become her sanctuary over the years. As she pushed through the wooden gate, her fingers traced the smooth surface of a hand-carved wooden bird perched on her fence post. Her father had carved it for her 23rd birthday, the year before consumption claimed his life. "For my little songbird," he had said, his eyes already showing the fever that would take him. "May you always remember that the most beautiful songs come from the gentlest hearts." Eleanor had been 24 when the whispers began in earnest, young enough that marriage was still expected, old enough that her unmarried state became a source of village speculation. At first the comments had been merely curious. "Such a lovely girl, why hasn't she found a husband yet? Perhaps she's too particular. Not everyone can afford to be choosy." But as months turned to years, curiosity had curdled into something more malicious. The village women, led by Margaret Whitmore and Mrs. Pemberton, had decided that Eleanor's continued spinsterhood must be a moral failing. They whispered about her father's books, which had taught her to read better than most men. They clucked their tongues at her garden, which produced vegetables that fed not only herself, but often the poorest families in winter. Unnatural, they called her love of learning. Prideful, they said of her independence. Eleanor had learned to ignore most of it, finding comfort in the rhythm of her days. Each morning began before dawn, when she would slip from her cottage to tend the chickens she kept behind her home. The hens clucked softly as she scattered grain, and the rooster, a magnificent bird she had named King George, would strut proudly among his feathered court. She had rescued most of her animals from various misfortunes. The three-legged cat that now sunned himself on her windowsill had been found half dead in a ditch. The elderly mare in her small stable had been destined for slaughter before Eleanor purchased her with her meager savings. Even her garden hosted refugees, roses transplanted from neglected graveyards, herbs saved from gardens of families who had moved away. Everything that came to Eleanor's care seemed to flourish under her attention. Her vegetables grew larger and sweeter than anyone else's. Her flowers bloomed longer and more vibrantly. Injured birds would appear on her doorstep, as if sensing the healing they might find in her gentle hands. Yet the villagers saw only what she lacked: a husband, children, a conventional life. Eleanor had always assumed they were right. She had convinced herself that her quiet contentment was enough, that the ache she sometimes felt when watching mothers with their children was simply the price of her chosen solitude. But Captain Blackthorne's words had shattered that careful acceptance. "She already is." The certainty in his voice suggested he saw something in her that she had never recognized in herself. As she moved through her morning routine, Eleanor found herself thinking about the two children at the captain's side. The little girl's torn dress and frightened eyes reminded her of a baby sparrow she had once found, fallen from its nest during a spring storm. The boy's protective stance near the smaller child spoke of a soul forced to mature too quickly, like the saplings in her garden that grew strong despite harsh winds. She paused in her garden, kneeling beside a patch of lamb's ear that she used for healing poultices. The soft, silvery leaves had soothed countless cuts and burns over the years. Her neighbors might mock her unmarried state, but they had no qualms about seeking her remedies when their children scraped their knees or their husbands returned home with fishing injuries. Eleanor had never thought to call this mothering, but as she ran the velvety leaves between her fingers, she began to wonder. Did love require blood bonds? Did nurturing need legal documentation? Or could it exist in the careful tending of all living things, in the patient healing of broken spirits, in the quiet strength that drew wounded creatures to her door? The wooden bird watched over her garden, its carved wings spread as if ready to take flight. Perhaps her father had known something she was only now beginning to understand. Perhaps the most important songs were not the ones others expected to hear, but the ones that called to lost souls seeking shelter. That evening, as Eleanor prepared her simple supper, she found herself setting 2 extra places at her small table without quite knowing why. Captain Marcus Blackthorne stood at the helm of the Crimson Tide, his weathered compass steady in his calloused palm. The brass instrument had guided him through countless storms and battles, over 15 years of piracy, but lately it seemed to point towards something beyond mere magnetic north, something that had little to do with treasure or conquest. 3 weeks earlier, his compass had led him to the wreckage of the merchant vessel Esperanza, broken apart on jagged rocks during a violent squall. Most pirates would have salvaged what they could and left the dead to the sea. But when Blackthorne heard the faint cries echoing from the ship's fractured hull, his compass had demanded a different course. He had found them huddled in the captain's quarters, Emma, clutching a torn silk dress that had once been powder blue, and Thomas, his young arms wrapped protectively around his sister as seawater rose around their ankles. Their parents lay still nearby, victims of the storm's fury. "Please," Thomas had whispered when Blackthorne appeared in the doorway like some dark angel, "don't hurt her. She's just little." The boy's courage in the face of certain death had stirred something long dormant in the captain's chest. Instead of the quick, merciful end he might have granted in his younger, crueler days, Blackthorne had scooped both children into his arms and carried them to safety. Now, as the Crimson Tide approached Millhaven's harbour, he could feel his crew's unease. Pirates were not nursemaids, and his men had made their feelings clear about the unexpected passengers. But every time Blackthorne considered leaving the children at the first convenient port, his compass seemed to grow warm in his pocket, as if urging him onward. Captain, his first mate, Jonas, approached with careful steps. "The men are wondering about our cargo. Perhaps Millhaven would be suitable for—" "The children stay until I decide otherwise." Blackthorne's voice cut through the salt air like a blade. His compass caught the morning light, its needle pointing steadily toward the small coastal village ahead. He had chosen Millhaven deliberately. Unlike the larger ports where his reputation preceded him like a funeral march, this fishing village was small enough that he might conduct his business quietly. His ship needed provisions, and the children needed stability, even if only for a night. Thomas emerged from below deck, his small hand clasped firmly in Emma's. The boy had appointed himself his sister's guardian, rarely leaving her side except when Blackthorne specifically ordered it. Emma had not spoken a single word since the rescue, communicating only through gestures and the occasional tear that would slide down her pale cheek. "Are we stopping here?" Thomas asked, his young voice trying to sound brave. Blackthorne knelt to the boy's level, his compass warm against his palm. "For provisions. You'll both stay close to me." Emma pressed closer to her brother, her blue eyes wide with the particular fear that came from losing everything safe in the world. Blackthorne had seen that look in mirrors during his own childhood, before the streets of Bristol had taught him that survival required a harder heart than most possessed. As the Crimson Tide glided into harbour, Blackthorne noted the villagers gathering on the docks. Some faces showed fear, others curiosity. A few displayed the calculating look of those wondering what profit might be made from a pirate's visit. But one face caught his attention, a woman standing apart from the crowd, her eyes not on him but on the children at his side. She was perhaps 30, with brown hair pinned simply back and clothing that spoke of modest means but careful maintenance. What struck him was not her appearance but her expression. Where others saw danger in his presence, she saw only 2 frightened children in need of comfort. His compass grew warmer still. "What's her name?" Thomas whispered, following Blackthorne's gaze. Before the captain could answer, the village busybodies began their performance. He listened with growing irritation as they mocked the woman's unmarried state, their words sharp with a cruelty he recognized all too well. When they declared she would never be a mother, something inside Blackthorne's chest ignited like cannon powder. His compass practically burned against his palm as he stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of 15 years commanding dangerous men in desperate situations. "She already is." The words surprised him with their certainty, but his compass had never steered him wrong. The silence that followed Blackthorne's declaration stretched across the harbour like a held breath. Margaret Whitmore's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish, her usual venomous words apparently lost somewhere between shock and indignation. Eleanor felt every eye in the village square turn toward her, but for once the attention did not bring shame. Captain Blackthorne's dark gaze held hers with a certainty that seemed to see straight through to her soul. In his weathered features, she recognized something unexpected, the same protective instinct that had driven her to rescue wounded creatures all her life. "I beg your pardon?" Margaret finally sputtered, her face flushing red beneath her bonnet. "That woman has never what?" Blackthorne's voice carried the quiet menace of a drawn sword. He stepped closer to Eleanor, the children still flanking him like small sentinels. "Has never shown kindness to those who needed it, has never offered healing to the hurt, has never opened her heart to creatures others had abandoned." Thomas looked up at the imposing captain with something approaching awe. In 3 weeks aboard the Crimson Tide, he had never heard the fearsome pirate speak with such passion about anything except navigation and battle strategy. Emma's small fingers worried a torn piece of fine silk that had once been part of her dress's sleeve. The fabric was blue as summer sky, a remnant of the wealthy life that had been torn away from her as surely as her parents. She clutched it like a talisman, the only tangible connection to the world she had lost. But as she watched Eleanor, something in the woman's gentle expression made her fingers slowly release their death grip on the silk. The torn piece fluttered to the ground between them, a bridge of sorts across the space that separated a frightened child from unexpected comfort. Eleanor noticed the falling silk immediately. Without thinking, she stepped forward and knelt, her movements slow and careful as one might use approaching a wounded animal. She picked up the delicate fabric, examining it with the same attention she gave to her garden's most fragile seedlings. "Such beautiful needlework," she said softly, addressing Emma directly for the first time. "Someone who loved you very much must have made this dress." The silence that followed Blackthorne's declaration stretched across the harbour like a held breath. Margaret Whitmore's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish, her usual venomous words apparently lost somewhere between shock and indignation. Eleanor felt every eye in the village square turned toward her, but for once the attention did not bring shame. Captain Blackthorne's dark gaze held hers with a certainty that seemed to see straight through to her soul. In his weathered features, she recognized something unexpected, the same protective instinct that had driven her to rescue wounded creatures all her life. "I beg your pardon?" Margaret finally sputtered, her face flushing red beneath her bonnet. "That woman has never what?" Blackthorne's voice carried the quiet menace of a drawn sword. He stepped closer to Eleanor, the children still flanking him like small sentinels. "Has never shown kindness to those who needed it, has never offered healing to the hurt, has never opened her heart to creatures others had abandoned." Thomas looked up at the imposing captain with something approaching awe. In 3 weeks aboard the Crimson Tide, he had never heard the fearsome pirate speak with such passion about anything except navigation and battle strategy. Emma's small fingers worried a torn piece of fine silk that had once been part of her dress's sleeve. The fabric was blue as summer sky, a remnant of the wealthy life that had been torn away from her as surely as her parents. She clutched it like a talisman, the only tangible connection to the world she had lost. But as she watched Eleanor, something in the woman's gentle expression made her fingers slowly release their death grip on the silk. The torn piece fluttered to the ground between them, a bridge of sorts across the space that separated a frightened child from unexpected comfort. Eleanor noticed the falling silk immediately. Without thinking, she stepped forward and knelt, her movements slow and careful as one might use approaching a wounded animal. She picked up the delicate fabric, examining it with the same attention she gave to her garden's most fragile seedlings. "Such beautiful needlework," she said softly, addressing Emma directly for the first time. "Someone who loved you very much must have made this dress." Emma's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. She took a tentative step toward Eleanor, drawn by something she couldn't name. The woman smelled of lavender and clean earth, like the garden that had called to Emma from the cottage windows. Thomas moved protectively closer to his sister, but his wariness began to soften as he watched Eleanor's careful gentleness. She handled the silk as if it were precious beyond measure, understanding instinctively that this scrap of fabric represented far more than mere clothing. "Would you like me to mend it?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have needles and thread at my cottage. We could make it part of something new, something just for you." The offer was simple, practical, but it carried weight that everyone present could feel. Mrs. Pemberton shifted uncomfortably, perhaps remembering her own harsh words about Eleanor's supposed unfitness. Mayor Cromwell cleared his throat nervously, sensing the shift in the crowd's mood. Emma surprised everyone, including herself, by taking another step toward Eleanor. Her small hand reached out, not quite touching the woman's outstretched palm, but close enough that the warmth between them was palpable. "You see?" Blackthorne's voice carried a note of vindication. "She already is what this child needs, what they both need." Margaret Whitmore rallied for one final assault. "This is preposterous. She's an unmarried woman with no experience." "Experience?" Blackthorne's laugh was sharp as a cutlass edge. "I've sailed with men who had experience robbing and killing. I've met nobles with experience in cruelty and neglect. Experience, madam, is not what these children require. They need someone with the heart to see their worth when others would overlook them entirely." Thomas found his voice for the first time since leaving the ship. "She has kind eyes," he said simply, his young voice carrying across the square. "Like Mama used to." The comparison hit Eleanor like a physical blow, but not one of pain. Instead, she felt something unfurling in her chest, like a flower that had waited years for the right season to bloom. Emma's hand finally made contact with Eleanor's palm, her small fingers curling trustingly around the woman's thumb. In that moment, the torn silk seemed less important than the connection being woven between them, stronger than any fabric and more precious than gold. Eleanor's cottage welcomed them like an embrace. As she pushed open the wooden gate, the children pressed close behind her, Thomas keeping one protective hand on Emma's shoulder while his eyes darted nervously toward the shadows. Captain Blackthorne followed at a distance, his imposing presence somehow both reassuring and unsettling in the domestic space. The garden path wound between carefully tended beds of herbs and vegetables. Emma's steps slowed as she noticed the flowers, roses climbing wooden trellises, lavender bushes humming with bees, and marigolds that seemed to glow like small suns in the afternoon light. For the first time since the shipwreck, something other than fear flickered in her blue eyes. "Are you hungry?" Eleanor asked as she led them toward her front door. The children had not eaten since dawn, and their hollow cheeks spoke of meals missed even before that. "I have soup warming on the fire." Thomas nodded carefully, still uncertain whether this kindness might be withdrawn as quickly as it was offered. Emma remained silent, but her small stomach chose that moment to rumble audibly, earning a gentle smile from Eleanor. The cottage interior was simple but warm. Dried herbs hung from the ceiling beams, filling the air with the scent of sage and rosemary. Books lined wooden shelves, more than most villagers owned, and a kettle sang softly over the hearth fire. Everything spoke of a life lived thoughtfully, with attention to small comforts. Eleanor moved to her kitchen area and retrieved a simple clay bowl from her cupboard. It was nothing special to look at, plain brown pottery with a small chip on one side where she had dropped it years ago, but as she ladled thick vegetable soup into its depths, the bowl seemed to transform into something precious. "Here," she said, kneeling to Emma's height and offering the warm bowl with both hands. "Careful, it's still hot." Emma accepted the bowl as if it were made of spun gold. The soup smelled of carrots and onions, parsley and potatoes, but most importantly, it smelled of safety. She took a tentative sip, her eyes closing as warmth spread through her small body for the first time in weeks. Thomas received his own bowl, and Eleanor watched with quiet satisfaction as both children began to eat with the focused intensity of the truly hungry. She filled a third bowl and offered it to Blackthorne, who had been standing awkwardly near the door like a bear, unsure whether it belonged in a tea parlour. "I thank you," he said, accepting the bowl with surprising gentleness. "But I should return to my ship. My men will be wondering." "Let them wonder," Eleanor said firmly. "These children need more than one meal, and you look as though you could use the rest yourself." It was true. The captain's weathered face showed the strain of 3 weeks caring for traumatized children while managing a ship full of restless pirates. He had barely slept, keeping constant watch over Thomas and Emma as they struggled with nightmares and tears. Emma finished her soup and leaned against Eleanor's chair, her small body finally beginning to relax. Without thinking, Eleanor's hand found the child's tangled hair, smoothing it with the same gentle touch she used with injured birds. "Your garden is beautiful," Thomas said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mamma had roses like yours. Before." Eleanor's heart clenched at the boy's wistful tone. "Would you like to help me tend them? Gardens always grow better with many hands caring for them." Thomas nodded eagerly, the first spark of genuine interest she had seen in his young face. Emma looked up at Eleanor with trust beginning to bloom in her eyes, like a flower turning toward the sun. From his position near the door, Blackthorne watched this domestic scene with an expression of wonder and confusion. He had commanded ships through hurricanes and fought enemies with sword and pistol, but this gentle magic that Eleanor wove around the children was beyond his understanding. Outside, he could hear voices carrying on the evening breeze, villagers discussing the strange events at the harbour, speculating about the pirate captain and his unexpected charges. But inside the cottage, wrapped in the warmth of Eleanor's simple clay bowl and gentler kindness, such gossip seemed to belong to another world entirely. Emma fell asleep in Eleanor's lap before the sun set, her small fingers still clutching the mended piece of blue silk. The screams came at midnight. Eleanor jolted awake in her chair beside the hearth, where she had been keeping watch over the sleeping children. Emma thrashed on the small cot Eleanor had prepared, her small fists beating at invisible attackers while tears streamed down her pale cheeks. "The water!" Thomas cried out from his own makeshift bed. "Emma, hold on, don't let go!" Eleanor moved quickly to comfort them, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. She had expected nightmares. Children who had survived such trauma rarely slept peacefully. But the intensity of their terror suggested memories far worse than she had imagined. Captain Blackthorne appeared in the doorway like a dark guardian angel, fully dressed despite the late hour. Eleanor realized he had likely been standing watch outside her cottage, unwilling to leave the children completely unprotected. "The dreams come every night," he said quietly, moving to help calm Thomas while Eleanor gathered Emma into her arms. "Sometimes worse than others." Emma buried her face against Eleanor's shoulder, her small body shaking with sobs that seemed too large for someone so tiny. Eleanor hummed softly, a lullaby her own mother had sung, and gradually felt the child's trembling begin to ease. "What happened to them?" Eleanor asked, when both children had finally settled back into restless sleep. "Beyond the shipwreck, I mean. There's something you're not telling me." Blackthorne hesitated, his weathered hands turning something over in his pocket. After a long moment, he withdrew a small object wrapped in dark cloth. As he unwrapped it, Eleanor gasped. A locket, no larger than a child's palm, gleamed in the firelight. But what made Eleanor's breath catch was not the intricate gold work or the tiny pearls around its edge. It was the dark stains that marred its surface, stains that could only be blood. "I found this clutched in Emma's hand when I pulled her from the wreckage," Blackthorne explained, his voice heavy with memories he clearly wished he didn't carry. "She won't let me clean it, won't let me open it, but I've seen enough noble houses to recognize quality when I see it." Eleanor accepted the locket with reverent care, feeling its weight both physical and emotional. "May I?" Emma stirred at Eleanor's voice, her eyes fluttering open. When she saw the locket in Eleanor's hands, she made a small sound of distress but didn't try to reclaim it. Instead, she nodded almost imperceptibly. The locket opened with a soft click, revealing a miniature portrait that made Eleanor's heart race. A woman with Emma's delicate features and golden hair stared back at her, but this was no merchant's wife. The subject wore a crown of silver and sapphires, her clothing rich with the kind of embroidery that spoke of royal lineage. "Dear God," Eleanor whispered, "she's nobility. They both are. More than nobility," Blackthorne said grimly. The ship they were traveling on was flying diplomatic colors. The Esperanza was carrying passengers of significant importance when that storm hit. "Or when someone wanted it to look like a storm," Thomas said quietly from his cot. Both adults turned to look at him, surprised to find his young eyes open and alert. Mama said Uncle Aldrich was angry about the succession. She said he would do terrible things to keep Emma from her birthright. Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "Birthright? Emma's the heir," Thomas continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "When grandfather dies, the crown should go to her, not Uncle Aldrich, but she has to live long enough to claim it." Blackthorne's expression darkened. "Which explains why my lookout spotted 3 ships following us yesterday. I thought they might be naval vessels responding to reports of piracy, but now..." He didn't need to finish the thought. Eleanor understood. Somewhere out there, powerful enemies were hunting these children, and her small cottage offered precious little protection against the kind of people who would murder children for a throne. Emma reached up and touched Eleanor's face with tiny, cold fingers. "Mama said to trust kind people," she whispered, speaking for the first time since her rescue. "Are you a kind people?" Eleanor's heart broke and healed simultaneously. "Yes, sweetheart, I am." 3 days passed in a rhythm that surprised everyone with its gentle normalcy. Eleanor had established routines that seemed to calm the children's fractured nerves: morning walks through her garden, afternoon reading lessons by the window, and evening meals prepared from recipes in her mother's worn cookbook. The leather-bound volume had belonged to 3 generations of women before Eleanor, its pages yellowed with age and spotted with decades of kitchen mishaps. Her grandmother had written notes in faded ink alongside traditional recipes. Her mother had added her own observations in careful script, and now Eleanor found herself teaching Emma to read, using the familiar words of honey cakes for harvest time and healing broth for winter ailments. "What does this word say?" Emma asked, her small finger pointing to an entry written in Eleanor's mother's hand. "Comfort," Eleanor replied, noting how the child's reading had improved remarkably in just 3 days. "This recipe is for comfort soup, meant to warm hearts as well as bodies." Thomas looked up from where he was carefully transplanting seedlings under Eleanor's guidance. His hands, initially clumsy with the delicate work, had grown steadier with each passing hour. "Is that what you made for us the first night?" "A variation of it," Eleanor smiled. "Every family changes recipes to suit their own needs. That's how traditions grow and adapt." Captain Blackthorne watched these domestic scenes from various vantage points around the cottage, clearly struggling with feelings he didn't know how to name. He would appear at the garden gate during morning walks, ostensibly checking on the children's safety, but lingering to watch Thomas carefully water the herb plants. He stood in doorways during reading lessons, his weathered face softening as Emma's laughter filled the cottage when she successfully sounded out a particularly difficult word. "You're welcome to join us," Eleanor had offered more than once, but the captain always found reasons to decline. A pirate ship required constant attention, his crew needed supervision, supplies had to be negotiated. All true, but Eleanor suspected the real reason was that Marcus Blackthorne had no idea how to exist in a world where gentleness was not seen as weakness. On the 3rd afternoon, as Eleanor prepared comfort soup from her mother's recipe, she became aware of Thomas standing very close to her elbow, watching every movement with intense concentration. "Would you like to help?" she asked. Thomas nodded eagerly. Eleanor guided his small hands as they chopped vegetables together, his knife work improving under her patient instruction. Emma abandoned her reading to watch, fascinated by the transformation of simple ingredients into something nourishing. "Mama used to cook with us," Emma said quietly. Before Uncle Aldrich said it wasn't proper for royal children to work in kitchens, Eleanor's hands stilled for a moment. "Your uncle sounds like he doesn't understand the most important lessons." "What lessons?" Thomas asked. "That love grows strongest in everyday moments, that taking care of others teaches us to take care of ourselves, that the hands that tend gardens and cook meals are the same hands that build families." Through the window, Eleanor could see Captain Blackthorne conferring with two members of his crew near the garden gate. Their expressions were serious, and she caught fragments of conversation that made her uneasy. Words like pursuit and time running out drifted through the glass. But inside the cottage, life continued its healing rhythm. Emma carefully copied letters from the recipe book, her tongue poking out in concentration as she formed each curve and line. Thomas told stories about the royal gardens he remembered from his early childhood, his voice growing stronger as Eleanor listened with genuine interest. "We had a maze made of roses," he said, adding carrots to the soup pot. "Emma got lost in it once and the whole palace was searching for her. But she wasn't scared. She was having an adventure." Emma giggled at the memory. "Cook found me eating strawberries in the center of the maze. I had berry juice all over my dress, and Uncle Aldrich was so angry." "Uncle Aldrich seems to be angry about many things," Eleanor observed carefully. The children's faces grew somber. "He says children should be seen and not heard," Emma whispered. "He says little girls especially should never speak unless spoken to." Eleanor felt a familiar fire kindle in her chest, the same protective fury that had driven her to rescue injured animals all her life. "Uncle Aldrich," she said firmly, "is wrong about many things. Children should laugh and learn and ask questions and get strawberry juice on their clothes. That's how they grow into strong, kind adults." Outside, Captain Blackthorne's conversation with his crew grew more intense, but Eleanor chose to focus on the moment at hand, teaching two traumatized children that love could be found in simple recipes passed down through generations of women who understood that the most important ingredient was care. Thomas found the piece of driftwood on their fourth morning walk along the shore. It had been carved and smoothed by countless tides until it resembled the hull of a miniature ship, and something about its weathered surface called to him like a whispered memory. "May I keep it?" he asked Eleanor, turning the wood over in his small hands. "Of course," Eleanor replied, though she noticed how his fingers traced the wood's curves with an intensity that suggested more than casual interest. "What will you do with it?" "Build something," Thomas said, but his eyes had grown distant. "Something to help me remember." That afternoon, while Emma practiced her letters and Eleanor mended clothing by the window, Thomas worked with quiet concentration at the kitchen table. Using Eleanor's small knife under her careful supervision, he began shaping the driftwood into something more deliberate. Masts appeared, carved from twigs he had gathered. Dark scraps of fabric, donated from Eleanor's mending basket, became tiny sails that billowed in miniature perfection. The model ship that emerged was unmistakably a replica of the Crimson Tide, complete with its distinctive black sails and sleek lines. But more than craftsmanship, the little vessel carried emotional weight. As Thomas worked, his hands grew steadier, his breathing more even, as if the act of creation was healing something broken inside him. "It's beautiful," Eleanor said truthfully. "You have your mother's artistic gift." Thomas smiled, the first truly peaceful expression she had seen cross his young face. "She used to paint ships. She said they represented freedom." Their quiet afternoon was interrupted by voices from the village square. Eleanor looked up from her mending to see two men in dark travelling clothes speaking with Mayor Cromwell. Something about their bearing, the way they held themselves apart from the villagers, made unease settle in her stomach. "Stay inside," she told the children quietly. "I'll be right back." Eleanor slipped out her back door and made her way through her garden to a position where she could hear the conversation without being seen. What she heard made her blood run cold. "We're seeking two children who may have been brought here by a pirate vessel. one of the strangers was saying. His accent marked him as educated, possibly nobility, but his eyes held no warmth. A boy of about 9, a girl somewhat younger. They would be travelling under false circumstances. Pirates? Mayor Cromwell's voice carried nervous excitement. We did have a visit from Captain Blackthorne's ship 3 days ago, but what children were with him? The second stranger interrupted. Eleanor didn't wait to hear more. She slipped back to her cottage, her mind racing. Inside, she found Captain Blackthorne had arrived while she was gone, his face grim as he studied Thomas's model ship. Trouble? Eleanor asked quietly. My crew spotted ships on the horizon this morning, he confirmed. 3 vessels flying colours I don't recognize. They're closing in. Thomas looked up from his model, understanding passing between him and the captain without words needed. The boy's hands tightened protectively around his creation. Uncle Aldrich found us, Emma whispered from her chair by the window. She had been watching the strangers in the square, her face pale with recognition. How long do we have? Eleanor asked, surprising herself with her calm. Perhaps a day if we're fortunate, Blackthorne replied. My ship is provisioned, but carrying children into a sea battle is not an option, Eleanor finished firmly. There must be another way. Thomas stood suddenly, his model ship cradled against his chest. The caves, he said. Emma, do you remember? Mama told us stories about the smugglers' caves. She said if we were ever in terrible danger. Emma nodded, understanding dawning in her blue eyes. The hidden places by the cliffs. She said they were safe because only fishermen knew about them. Eleanor felt pieces of a plan beginning to form. Her cottage sat near enough to the coastal cliffs that she had often heard stories of the old smuggling tunnels, though she had never explored them herself. Can your ship reach us from the seaside of the cliffs? She asked Blackthorne. Given time to navigate the rocks, yes? The captain's eyes sharpened with tactical interest. You're thinking of an escape route that doesn't involve the harbour. I'm thinking of keeping these children alive, Eleanor corrected, whatever it takes. Thomas held his model ship higher, the black sails catching the late afternoon light. We'll need this, he said with quiet certainty, to remember we're not afraid of storms anymore. The 5th morning dawned with unusual quiet, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Eleanor woke to find Emma curled against her side in the narrow bed, having climbed in during the night after another bout of nightmares. The child's small hand clutched something carefully against her chest. What do you have there, sweetheart? Eleanor whispered. Emma sat up slowly, her golden hair catching the morning light streaming through the cottage windows. With shy pride, she opened her fingers to reveal a makeshift bookmark, crafted from pressed flowers and a strip of ribbon from Eleanor's sewing basket. I made it for you, Emma said, her voice soft but clear, for your mother's book, so you won't lose your place when you read to us. Eleanor accepted the gift with hands that trembled slightly. Between 2 pieces of thin glass that Emma had somehow found and cleaned, delicate wildflowers lay perfectly preserved, a violet from the garden path, a piece of baby's breath from near the gate, and a small yellow buttercup that grew wild behind the cottage. The ribbon, a pale blue that matched Emma's eyes, had been carefully tied around the glass to hold everything together. It's the most beautiful bookmark I've ever seen, Eleanor said truthfully. Her throat tightened with emotion as she realized this was the first thing either child had created since their rescue, the first sign that beauty could return to their world. Thomas appeared in the doorway, drawn by their quiet voices. His face lit up when he saw his sister's handiwork. Emma always made the prettiest things at the palace, he said with obvious pride. Mama said she had artist's hands, just like her brother, Eleanor replied, thinking of the careful way Thomas had carved his model ship. You both have gifts that no one can take away. Captain Blackthorne's silhouette filled the cottage doorway, but this morning he didn't hover uncertainly at the threshold. Instead, he stepped inside with something approaching familiarity, accepting the cup of tea Eleanor offered with a nod of gratitude. Eleanor watched him observe the children's morning routines, Emma's careful arrangement of her bookmark among Eleanor's things, Thomas's gentle attention to the potted herbs on the windowsill that he had appointed himself to tend. The captain's weathered features had grown softer over the past few days, as if witnessing this domestic harmony was teaching him something he had never known he needed to learn. "They're different children than the ones I pulled from that wreckage," he said quietly while Emma and Thomas were occupied with their breakfast. "They're the same children," Eleanor corrected. "They're just remembered how to be children again." Something in her voice made Blackthorne look at her more closely. "And you? Have you remembered something as well?" The question caught Eleanor off guard. Had she changed? Certainly her days had taken on new meaning, structured around small needs and smaller victories. She found herself thinking in terms of we instead of I, planning meals that would tempt Emma's fragile appetite and activities that would engage Thomas's quick mind. "Perhaps," she admitted, "I've remembered what it feels like to be needed." Their conversation was interrupted by Emma's sudden exclamation. The child had climbed onto Eleanor's chair to examine the higher shelves and was pointing excitedly at a small wooden box. "What's in there, Mama?" Emma asked, then froze as she realized what she had said. The word hung in the cottage air like a benediction. Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes, not of sadness, but of overwhelming recognition. This was what she had been waiting for her entire life without knowing it. This moment when a child's trust became complete enough for such a precious word. "Oh, sweetheart," Eleanor whispered, gathering Emma into her arms. "Say it again." "Mama," Emma repeated, this time with certainty and joy. Thomas looked up from his breakfast, his young face serious. "Is it all right if I call you that too? I know you're not our real mama, but family isn't always about blood," Eleanor finished, remembering words Captain Blackthorne had spoken days ago. "Sometimes it's about choice and love and choosing to stay even when things get difficult." From across the room, Blackthorne watched this moment unfold with something approaching reverence. In 5 days, Eleanor had accomplished what his weeks of careful protection could not. She had given these children back their capacity for joy. The assassin arrived with the evening tide, dressed as a simple merchant but carrying death in his travel pack. Eleanor first glimpsed him from her kitchen window as she prepared supper. Something about his purposeful stride through the village square, setting off every instinct she had developed for recognizing danger. Captain Blackthorne appeared at her back door without knocking, his face grim. "Gather what you need. We leave within the hour." "What's happened?" Eleanor asked, though the children's sudden silence behind her suggested they already knew. "3 of my crew are dead," Blackthorne said quietly. "Killed at the tavern not an hour ago by a man asking questions about royal children, professional work, clean and quick." Eleanor's hands stilled over the bread she had been slicing. Thomas moved protectively closer to Emma, who had gone pale as winter frost. "Show her, Thomas," Blackthorne commanded gently. With trembling fingers, Thomas produced something from beneath his shirt, a silver dagger no longer than Eleanor's hand, its blade inscribed with symbols that seemed to writhe in the firelight. The hilt bore a crest she recognized from the locket, the royal arms of Emma and Thomas's birthright. "I found it on my pillow when I woke from my nap," Thomas whispered. "He was in our room. He was in here while we slept." Eleanor felt cold terror wash over her. Someone had been in her cottage, close enough to harm the children, close enough to kill them all if he had chosen. The violation of her safe space felt like a physical blow. "The message is clear," Blackthorne continued. "Duke Aldrich knows exactly where they are. This was a warning. Next time, there won't be one." "Then we run," Eleanor said immediately. "Tonight, however far we need to go." "Eleanor." Blackthorne's voice was heavy with something she had never heard from him before, uncertainty. "You don't understand what you're offering to face. This isn't village gossip or small cruelties. Aldrich has assassins in every port, spies in every court. He has ships, soldiers, gold enough to hunt us across every ocean." Eleanor looked at the dagger in Thomas's small hands, then at Emma's terrified face, and felt something settle in her chest with the weight of absolute certainty. "I understand perfectly," she said. "These children are in danger. Someone wants to hurt them for something they were born to, not something they chose. And you're asking me to abandon them because the danger is too great." "I'm asking you to consider your own life," Blackthorne said desperately. "You could have a quiet existence here, safety, peace, a normal future." Eleanor almost laughed. "Normal? Captain, for 34 years I've been told I wasn't good enough for normal, not fit for marriage, not suited for motherhood, not worthy of the life other women take for granted. And now, when I finally have something worth fighting for, you want me to choose safety over family?" Thomas stepped forward, his young voice strong despite his fear. "The dagger has Uncle Aldrich's personal seal. He sent his best assassin. That means he's desperate," Emma finished, her voice barely above a whisper. "Grandfather must be dying. If I don't claim the throne soon, Uncle Aldrich becomes king by default." Eleanor knelt to the children's level, taking the dangerous dagger from Thomas's hands and setting it carefully aside. "Listen to me, both of you. I don't care about thrones or kingdoms or political games played by powerful men. I care about keeping you safe and letting you grow up to choose your own lives." "Even if it means running forever?" Thomas asked. "Even if it means fighting forever," Eleanor replied. "You're my children now. That means I will protect you with everything I have." From outside came the sound of boots on her garden path, multiple sets moving with military precision. Blackthorne's hand moved to his sword hilt as voices called out in the gathering darkness. "Eleanor Hartwell!" The voice carried authority and menace in equal measure. "By order of His Grace Duke Aldrich, you will surrender the royal children in your custody. Refuse, and you will be charged with treason against the crown." Eleanor stood slowly, feeling years of quiet acceptance transform into something far more dangerous. She moved to her window and saw torches surrounding her cottage, armed men in Aldrich's colours, and the cold-eyed assassin who had violated her home standing among them. "Then charge me," she called back. "These children are under my protection now." Eleanor moved with quiet purpose through her cottage as voices continued to call threats from outside. While Blackthorne positioned himself at the front window and the children huddled together near the fireplace, she disappeared into the small room that had been her father's study. Hidden beneath loose floorboards lay something the village had forgotten: her father's military musket from his service in His Majesty's Navy. The weapon was wrapped in oiled cloth, its metal parts carefully maintained despite years of disuse. Alongside it rested a powder horn and a small bag of shot, evidence of a man who had understood that peace required preparation. "I didn't know you had that," Blackthorne said as Eleanor emerged with the musket, checking its mechanisms with practiced efficiency. "Father taught me to shoot when I was 12. Eleanor replied calmly. He said a woman living alone needed to be able to defend herself, even in a quiet village. She met the captain's surprised gaze. "I'm not as defenseless as people assume." Thomas looked up from where he had been comforting Emma. "Can you really use it?" "Yes," Eleanor's voice carried quiet certainty. "But I hope I won't have to." "The cottage is surrounded," Blackthorne reported from the window. "At least a dozen men, professionally positioned. They're not planning to rush us, which means they're planning something worse." Eleanor moved to the back of the cottage, her mind working through possibilities her father's tactical training had taught her to consider. Her garden shed contained tools that could serve as weapons, her well-provided water for a siege, and her knowledge of the local terrain offered advantages the attackers couldn't anticipate. "Thomas," she said quietly, "remember what you told us about the smugglers' caves? How far are they from here?" "Maybe a quarter-mile through the woods," Thomas replied. "But the path is dangerous at night." "More dangerous than staying here?" Eleanor asked. Emma spoke up, her small voice determined. "I can remember the way. Mama used to tell us stories about brave children who escaped through secret passages. She made me memorize the landmarks." Blackthorne studied both children with new respect. "How long would it take you to reach the caves?" "If we move carefully, maybe an hour," Thomas estimated. "But they'll follow us." "Not if they think we're still here," Eleanor said, pieces of a plan forming in her mind. "Captain, how many of your crew remain loyal?" 6 men I trust completely, 3 others wavering between loyalty and self-preservation." Blackthorne's expression darkened. The rest have already fled rather than face Duke Aldrich's forces. Eleanor nodded, understanding. Pirates were businessmen first, and this fight offered little profit for enormous risk. Then we work with what we have, she decided. 6 loyal men, 2 brave children, and 1 woman who's tired of running from bullies. She began gathering supplies with methodical efficiency, food that would travel well, blankets for the children, medicines from her herbal stores. Thomas and Emma helped without being asked, their fear transformed into purposeful action. We'll need a diversion, Blackthorne said, studying the positions of the men outside. Something to draw them away from the cottage long enough for you to reach the woods. Your ship can provide that, Eleanor suggested. If your remaining crew creates a disturbance at the harbour, they're pirates, not martyrs, Blackthorne interrupted, asking them to sacrifice themselves for children they barely know. Emma tugged at Eleanor's skirt. What if we don't all go together? Both adults looked down at her. What do you mean, sweetheart? Uncle Aldrich wants us alive for now, Emma explained with wisdom far beyond her 7 years. He needs me to formally renounce my claim before he can be crowned. That means his men won't hurt us if they catch us, but they might hurt you and Captain Blackthorne. Absolutely not, Eleanor said firmly. We stay together. Listen to her, Thomas urged. Emma's right about Uncle Aldrich. He's cruel, but he's not stupid. He needs us alive and unmarked for the ceremony. Through the windows they could see torches moving as the attackers repositioned themselves. Time was running out. Eleanor checked her father's musket one final time, ensuring the powder was dry and the shot properly seated. The weapon felt familiar in her hands, awakening memories of target practice sessions when her father had taught her that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but action taken despite it. Then we use their need for you as our advantage, she said finally. But I'm not sending you into danger alone. We face this together, as a family. The betrayal came from the last person Eleanor expected. Mayor Cromwell appeared at her front door just after dawn, flanked by 2 men in judicial robes and carrying a leather portfolio that radiated official menace. Behind them stood Margaret Whitmore, her expression a mixture of triumph and false righteousness that made Eleanor's stomach turn. Eleanor Hartwell, Mayor Cromwell's voice shook with nervous authority, by order of the High Court, and in accordance with the Children's Welfare Act, you are hereby served notice that custody of the minor children currently in your care is to be transferred immediately to proper legal guardians. Eleanor felt the world shift beneath her feet. Thomas and Emma pressed closer to her sides, their small hands clutching at her skirts as one of the robed men produced an ornate quill pen and began making notations in an official ledger. What legal guardians? Eleanor demanded. These children have no family save their rightful uncle, His Grace Duke Aldrich, the first judicial officer interrupted, who has petitioned the court for emergency custody based on evidence of your moral unfitness to serve as guardian to children of royal blood. Captain Blackthorne stepped forward from the shadows, his hand resting on his sword hilt. What evidence? Margaret Whitmore stepped forward with obvious relish. Testimony from concerned citizens of Millhaven regarding Miss Hartwell's unsuitable character, her unmarried state, her association with known criminals, her complete lack of experience in child-rearing. The second judicial officer consulted his papers. Witness statements indicate that the accused has never married, has no children of her own, and has demonstrated a pattern of antisocial behavior that renders her unfit for guardianship responsibilities. Eleanor stared at Mayor Cromwell, understanding flooding through her like icy water. You gave them my history. You told them exactly what to write to make me look unfit. The mayor couldn't meet her eyes. The Duke's representatives made it clear that cooperation would be beneficial for the village. New trade agreements, reduced taxes, protection from pirate raids. So you sold us for gold, Blackthorne said, his voice deadly quiet. I sold nothing, Mayor Cromwell protested. I simply provided factual information about Miss Hartwell's circumstances. The court reached its own conclusions about her suitability. The first judicial officer cleared his throat impatiently. Miss Hartwell, according to sworn testimony from multiple witnesses, you have never successfully maintained a romantic relationship, have no experience with children, and have chosen to live in isolation from proper society. Furthermore, your recent association with pirates and criminals demonstrates questionable judgment regarding the children's safety. These accusations are fabrications based on malicious gossip, Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the fury building in her chest. Are they? Margaret Whitmore stepped forward. Can you deny that you've never been married? Can you deny that these are the first children you've ever cared for? Can you deny that you're harboring a known pirate in your home? Emma tugged at Eleanor's skirt. Mama? The word cut through the legal proceeding like a blade. Both judicial officers looked up sharply, their expressions shifting as they realized this was no distant arrangement, but a family bond. The child has been coached to use that term, Margaret said quickly. It's clearly an attempt to manipulate the court's sympathy. Nobody coached us, Thomas said, his young voice carrying remarkable strength. Eleanor is our mother now. She chose us, and we chose her. The first judicial officer consulted his papers again. Be that as it may, children often form inappropriate attachments to temporary caregivers. The court's responsibility is to their long-term welfare, not their immediate emotional comfort. Eleanor felt the poisoned quill pen scratching across official documents, each stroke sealing words designed to wound her more deeply than any blade. Every lonely year, every village slight, every moment of doubt about her worth was being weaponized against her love for these children. Your Honor, Captain Blackthorne stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to command. I respectfully submit that Duke Aldrich's claim to these children is suspect. The circumstances of their parents' deaths warrant investigation before any custody decisions are made. Captain Marcus Blackthorne, the second officer said with obvious distaste. Your reputation precedes you. The court is hardly inclined to accept legal advice from a wanted pirate, then accept it from someone who rescued these children from certain death, Blackthorne replied. Someone who has watched Eleanor Hartwell provide them with more love and safety in 5 days than they had known in months. The mayor shifted uncomfortably. The documents are properly executed. Miss Hartwell must surrender the children immediately or face charges of contempt of court. Eleanor looked down at Thomas and Emma, seeing her own determination reflected in their young faces. And if I refuse? Emma's small voice cut through the legal proceedings like a church bell. Show them the seal, Thomas. Thomas looked confused for a moment, then understanding dawned in his eyes. He moved to the corner where Emma's torn blue dress lay carefully folded, the garment she had worn during their rescue, but had been too damaged to wear again. Emma, are you certain? Thomas asked quietly. The little girl nodded with determination that seemed far beyond her 7 years. Mama Eleanor should know the truth. Everyone should know the truth. Under the watchful eyes of the judicial officers, Thomas carefully examined the dress's lining. His small fingers found a nearly invisible seam that had been sewn with different thread, so skillfully hidden that even Eleanor had missed it during her attempts to mend the garment. With delicate precision, Thomas opened the seam and withdrew something that made everyone in the room draw breath sharply. A royal seal of pure gold, no larger than a child's palm, bearing the true coat of arms of the realm and inscribed with words that made the judicial officers step back in obvious shock. Princess Emma Charlotte Adelaide, rightful heir to the throne of Valdoria, by divine right and sacred blood, Thomas read aloud, his young voice carrying the weight of centuries. This seal confirms her claim above all others, including those who would usurp her crown through treachery and murder. The silence that followed was profound. Mayor Cromwell's face had gone white, while Margaret Whitmore stared at the seal as if it might burst into flames. The first judicial officer cleared his throat nervously. That changes certain aspects of the legal situation. Does it? Captain Blackthorne's voice carried dangerous satisfaction. Because it seems to me that Duke Aldrich has been attempting to have his own niece murdered to secure a throne that rightfully belongs to her. Eleanor felt pieces of a larger puzzle falling into place with sickening clarity. The shipwreck wasn't an accident, was it? Aldrich arranged for his own brother and sister-in-law to die so he could claim the children were lost at sea. But when we survived, Thomas continued the logic. He had to find another way to eliminate Emma's claim. Legal documents declaring her guardian unfit would allow him to take custody and arrange a more permanent solution. Emma held up the golden seal, its surface catching the morning light. Uncle Aldrich told everyone that we died with our parents. He's probably already begun coronation preparations, counting on no one ever questioning the truth. The second judicial officer examined his papers with growing unease. These custody documents, they were prepared very quickly, suspiciously quickly, because Aldrich needed Eleanor declared unfit before anyone could question his version of events, Blackthorne said. A spinster with no family connections, no powerful friends, no legal resources to fight back, the perfect target for a calculated campaign of character assassination. Margaret Whitmore's face crumpled as understanding hit her. All those years of saying she wasn't fit to be a mother, you were doing Aldrich's work for him, Eleanor said quietly, making it easy for anyone who wanted to claim I was unworthy of children's trust. Mayor Cromwell sank into a chair, the full weight of his betrayal becoming clear. The Duke's representatives knew exactly what to ask me, because they already knew what people had been saying about you for years. And now you understand why, Thomas said with wisdom that broke Eleanor's heart. Uncle Aldrich has been planning this for a long time, probably since Emma was born and became the heir instead of him. The first judicial officer looked at his papers with obvious distress. These proceedings must be halted immediately. If these children are indeed royal heirs fleeing from an assassination attempt, then Eleanor Hartwell isn't an unfit guardian, Emma said firmly. She's the woman who saved our lives when our own family wanted us dead. Eleanor knelt beside Emma, taking the precious seal with reverent care. Sweetheart, this proves you're a princess. You could have any guardian in the kingdom, any privilege, any comfort. Emma's small hand found Eleanor's face, her touch gentle but certain. I already have what I want, Mama. I have you. From outside came the sound of approaching horses and the clank of armor. Through the window, Eleanor could see Duke Aldrich's colors flying from a column of mounted soldiers. The Duke himself comes to collect his prizes, Blackthorne observed grimly. This was never about legal custody. This was about silencing witnesses to his crimes. Eleanor stood, the royal seal warm in her palm. Then it's time Princess Emma reclaimed her birthright. The storm struck as Duke Aldrich's soldiers surrounded Eleanor's cottage, as if the very heavens protested the evil being attempted below. Rain lashed against the windows, while wind howled through the eaves, and Eleanor knew with grim certainty that their escape would have to happen now, in the worst possible conditions. The lighthouse lantern, she said suddenly, moving to the cupboard where she kept emergency supplies. The brass lantern had been her father's, designed to burn steadily even in fierce weather. If we can reach the cliffs, I can signal your ship. Captain Blackthorne studied the approaching soldiers through the rain-streaked window. 30 men at least, with more arriving. They mean to finish this tonight. Thomas clutched his model ship while Emma pressed close to Eleanor's side, both children pale but determined. Outside, Duke Aldrich's voice cut through the storm, commanding his men to positions around every possible escape route. There's no path they haven't covered, Blackthorne observed grimly. There's one, Eleanor said, lighting the lantern with steady hands. The old well behind my garden shed leads to an underground stream. Father showed me when I was young, in case of fire or siege. The captain's weathered face showed surprise and growing respect. You've been planning for this possibility. I've been planning for survival my entire life, Eleanor corrected. It just took me 34 years to find something worth surviving for. They moved through the cottage, gathering only essentials: the royal seal, Thomas's ship, Emma's pressed flower bookmark, and Eleanor's father's compass. Everything else would have to be abandoned to flames and Duke Aldrich's rage. The escape began in Eleanor's root cellar, where a hidden panel led to tunnels carved by generations of smugglers and desperate souls. The lantern's steady light guided them through passages that reeked of seawater and ancient fear, while above their heads boots tramped, and voices shouted orders. Emma stumbled in the narrow tunnel, her small legs struggling with the uneven stone floor, but she made no complaint. Thomas helped her over the worst obstacles, his protective instincts making him seem far older than his 9 years. "Almost there," Eleanor whispered as they emerged into a natural cave where underground streams met the sea. The storm's fury was even more apparent here, with waves crashing against the cave mouth and wind shrieking like vengeful spirits. Through the chaos, Eleanor spotted the Crimson Tide fighting to maintain position offshore, its black sails barely visible against the storm-darkened sky. She lifted the lighthouse lantern high, sending its beam out across the violent waters in the 3-long, 2-short pattern her father had taught her for emergency signals. An answering light flashed from the ship's deck. They had been seen. "Now comes the difficult part," Blackthorne said grimly as his crew lowered a boat into the savage waters. "Getting to them alive." The boat that reached them was manned by Jonas and 2 other loyal crew members, their faces grim with determination as they fought the waves. Eleanor had never been on the open ocean during a storm, and the small boat's violent pitching immediately challenged her stomach's resolve. But as nausea rose in her throat, she looked at Thomas and Emma huddled against her sides and found strength she didn't know she possessed. These children had already lost everything once. She would not let them face that terror again. "Hold tight to me," she told them, as the boat climbed impossible waves and plunged into valleys of water that seemed deep enough to swallow ships. "We're going home." "Home?" Emma asked, her small voice barely audible over the storm. "Wherever we're all together," Eleanor replied, clutching the lighthouse lantern as spray soaked them all. "That's home now." Captain Blackthorne's tactical genius became apparent as Duke Aldrich's pursuit ships appeared through the storm. Using the weather and his knowledge of hidden reefs, he led their enemies into dangerous waters while keeping the Crimson Tide in the deeper channels his years of experience had taught him to navigate. Eleanor watched from the deck, still holding her father's lantern, as enemy ships foundered on rocks that Blackthorne avoided with almost supernatural skill. The storm that had threatened their escape became their salvation, hiding them in its fury while punishing those who pursued them with murderous intent. As dawn broke over calmer seas, Eleanor realized they had survived the night that was meant to end their family forever. The pirate stronghold of Tortuga's Reach rose from the mist like something from a fever dream, its wooden fortifications and hidden harbors carved into cliffs that had defied royal navies for 3 generations. Eleanor stood at the Crimson Tide's rail, watching rough men and women emerge from caves and taverns to witness their arrival with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. "Not exactly the drawing rooms of polite society," Captain Blackthorne said, noting her expression. "Good," Eleanor replied, surprising him. "Polite society has spent years telling me I don't belong. Perhaps it's time I found people who understand what it means to be cast out." The stronghold's inhabitants were indeed a motley collection, former sailors who had chosen freedom over service, merchants who traded in goods no legitimate port would touch, and women who had fled lives that offered them no choices. But as Eleanor walked among them with Thomas and Emma at her sides, she noticed something unexpected. These outcasts showed the children genuine kindness, offering them trinkets and sweets without expectation of reward. "Little ones shouldn't have to run from kings," muttered old Sarah, a tavern-keeper whose scarred hands spoke of a violent past. "Bad enough when adults play their power games." Eleanor found herself housed in quarters that, while rough, had been hastily cleaned and furnished with whatever comfort the stronghold could provide. Thomas immediately claimed a corner near the window where the afternoon light was strongest, spreading out precious paper and charcoal that Jonas had procured from somewhere in the fortress's depths. "What are you drawing, sweetheart?" Eleanor asked as she braided Emma's hair by lamplight. Thomas looked up from his work with the concentration of an artist in the grip of inspiration. "Us," he said simply, "all of us together." The makeshift family portrait that emerged over the following hours was rough but unmistakably heartfelt. Thomas had drawn Eleanor in the center, her hand resting protectively on Emma's shoulder while his own figure stood close beside them. Captain Blackthorne appeared slightly apart but unmistakably part of the group, his hand on Thomas's shoulder in a gesture that spoke of belonging. "It's beautiful," Eleanor said truthfully, "but why now?" Thomas set down his charcoal, his young face serious. "Because Uncle Aldrich will come here soon, won't he? And when he does, everything might change. I wanted to draw us while we were still together." Emma looked up from the picture book Eleanor had been teaching her to read. "We'll always be together. Families don't break apart just because of danger." "Some do," Thomas said quietly. "Our first family did." Eleanor felt her heart clench at the boy's matter-of-fact acceptance of loss. She knelt beside his chair, studying the portrait with the attention it deserved. "Thomas, do you know what makes this picture special?" He shook his head. "You didn't draw us the way we were when we first met. You drew us the way we chose to become. That choice, that love we've built together. Uncle Aldrich can't take that away no matter what happens." Captain Blackthorne entered their quarters as she spoke, his weathered face showing the strain of preparations for the coming confrontation. "My scouts report Duke Aldrich's fleet is 3 days away at most, 20 ships, perhaps more." "How many do we have?" Eleanor asked. 5 ships committed to fighting. Maybe 8 if I can convince the more cautious captains that victory is possible." Blackthorne studied Thomas's portrait with something approaching reverence. "The others are already fleeing to safer waters." Thomas added careful details to Eleanor's face, his young artist's eye capturing the gentleness that had first drawn the children to trust her. "Captain Blackthorne," he said without looking up from his work, "if Uncle Aldrich wins, will you take care of Mama Eleanor?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a cannon's mouth. Eleanor saw something shift in the captain's expression, a recognition of responsibility that went far beyond his original promise to protect the children. "If Duke Aldrich wins," Blackthorne said carefully, "none of us will need protection because we'll all be together in whatever comes after." Emma giggled at this diplomatic non-answer. "You mean you'll take care of all of us forever?" "I mean," Blackthorne said, his voice gentle in a way Eleanor had rarely heard from him, "that families fight together." Outside their window, the stronghold prepared for war with the methodical efficiency of people who had spent their lives defying powerful enemies. But inside their rough quarters, lit by lamplight and warmed by love freely given, a makeshift family prepared to face whatever tomorrow might bring. Duke Aldrich's ships appeared at dawn like a dark crescent moon against the horizon, their royal banners snapping in the morning breeze as they moved to surround Tortuga's reach. Eleanor watched from the stronghold's highest tower as 20 warships took positions that would prevent any escape by sea. "He's not taking chances this time," Captain Blackthorne observed, his spyglass trained on the approaching fleet. Full military formation, cannon loaded for siege warfare. Eleanor studied the enemy positions with an eye her father's tactical training had sharpened. "He's making a mistake. What do you see that I don't?" Blackthorne asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. "He's positioned his ships for a traditional naval siege, but this isn't a traditional fortress." Eleanor pointed toward the eastern approach, where Duke Aldrich's largest vessels had anchored. "Those waters look deep enough for warships, but the charts in your cabin show hidden reefs just beneath the surface." Thomas looked up from where he had been working with a piece of rope, his small fingers weaving threads together in an intricate pattern. "Mama Eleanor, would you help us with something?" Eleanor knelt beside him, noting that Emma had gathered threads from all their clothing, blue silk from her royal dress, brown wool from Thomas's travel clothes, white cotton from Eleanor's simple shift, and black leather cord from Captain Blackthorne's coat. "We want to make bracelets," Emma explained, her small hands already working the threads together. "So we'll always be connected, even if Uncle Aldrich tries to separate us. Like sailors do before dangerous voyages," Thomas added. "A promise that we're crew together, no matter what." Eleanor felt tears threaten as she helped them braid the disparate threads into something stronger than its individual parts. The symbolism was not lost on anyone, 4 people from completely different worlds, woven together by choice and love into bonds that couldn't be broken by force. Captain Blackthorne accepted his bracelet with surprising gentleness, tying it around his weathered wrist with hands that had drawn swords and signed death warrants, but now trembled slightly with emotion. "I've never had family before," he admitted quietly. "Didn't think I was the sort of man who could." "Family isn't about the sort of man you were," Eleanor said, adjusting Emma's tiny bracelet. "It's about the sort of man you choose to become." A commotion from the harbour drew their attention. Jonas was running up the path from the docks, his face grim with urgency. "Captain! Duke Aldrich is sending a negotiation party under a flag of truce. He wants to parley. Let him come," Eleanor said before Blackthorne could respond. "It's time Princess Emma reclaimed what's rightfully hers." Thomas and Emma exchanged glances, some silent communication passing between them. "We want to be there when you meet him," Emma said with royal authority that surprised everyone. "Uncle Aldrich needs to see that we're not afraid anymore." "Absolutely not," Blackthorne protested. "This is exactly what he wants, to get close enough to harm you." "He won't harm us in front of witnesses," Thomas said with wisdom beyond his years. "He still needs the ceremony to make his claim legitimate, but he needs to know that we have people who will fight for us." Eleanor studied both children, seeing determination where weeks ago there had been only terror. "Are you certain this is what you want?" "We're certain," Emma said, unconsciously straightening her small shoulders in a gesture that spoke of royal breeding. "And we want everyone to see that our real mama isn't ashamed of us." The word mama still sent warmth through Eleanor's chest, but now it carried weight beyond emotion. These children were depending on her not just for comfort, but for courage, for the strength to face down a man who had murdered their parents for political gain. "Then we face him together," Eleanor decided. As a family, as they prepared to descend to the harbour, Eleanor noticed that the stronghold's other inhabitants were watching with something approaching awe. Old Sarah pressed a small knife into Eleanor's palm. "For luck, dearie. Sometimes even royal uncles need reminding about manners." The pirate crews that had initially been skeptical of harbouring royal children now looked ready to follow Eleanor into battle itself. Something about her quiet dignity and fierce maternal protection had earned their loyalty in ways gold never could. "Ready?" Blackthorne asked, checking his weapons one final time. Eleanor looked at her chosen family, two brave children wearing braided bracelets, and a pirate captain who had discovered his capacity for love. "Ready." Duke Aldrich arrived at the harbour with the arrogance of a man accustomed to having his will enforced by superior numbers. Eleanor watched him disembark from his flagship's boat, flanked by armed guards and carrying himself with the cold authority of someone who had never known defeat. He was younger than Eleanor had expected, perhaps 40, with the soft features of a man who had spent his life in palaces rather than battlefields. But his eyes held a cruelty that made her instinctively step closer to the children. "Uncle Aldrich," Emma said, her small voice carrying across the harbour with startling clarity. The Duke's attention fixed on his niece with satisfaction that made Eleanor's skin crawl. "Emma, my dear child, you've led us quite a chase, but it ends now." "Yes," Emma replied with quiet dignity, "it does." The Duke seemed taken aback by her composure. "You will return with me immediately, both of you. This woman has filled your heads with dangerous notions, but proper tutors will correct such nonsense." Thomas stepped forward, his model ship clutched protectively against his chest. "Eleanor isn't the one with dangerous notions, Uncle. You are." Eleanor felt a strange calm settle over her as she realized the moment had arrived. From her sewing basket, which she had carried to this confrontation for reasons she couldn't fully explain, she withdrew her mother's silver thimble. Such a simple thing, meant for pushing needles through stubborn fabric, but in this moment it felt like armor. "Your Grace," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the harbour, "these children are under my protection now. If you want them, you'll have to go through me." Duke Aldrich laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. "A spinster with a sewing basket against the Royal Navy? I think not." That was when Eleanor's tactical training revealed the flaw she had spotted from the tower. "Captain Blackthorne," she said clearly. "Signal the reef lights." Hidden pirates throughout the stronghold suddenly lit torches that illuminated the underwater obstacles Duke Aldrich's ships had unknowingly positioned themselves over. The Duke's confident expression faltered as he realized his fleet was trapped in shallow waters with no room to maneuver. "Now!" Eleanor called out. The battle began from multiple directions at once. Blackthorne's ships, positioned in the deeper channels Eleanor had identified, attacked the trapped warships from their blind spots. Shore batteries hidden in the cliffs opened fire on vessels that couldn't retreat. And from the stronghold itself, every pirate, smuggler, and outcast who had ever been dismissed by proper society fought with the fury of people defending their chosen family. Eleanor found herself in hand-to-hand combat when Duke Aldrich's guards attempted to seize the children. Her mother's thimble became an unexpected weapon, its metal surface catching an attacker's blade and deflecting it long enough for old Sarah's knife to find its mark. Emma surprised everyone by grabbing a sack of flour from the harbor supplies and hurling it into an enemy's face, temporarily blinding him. Thomas used his model ship as a club, the carefully carved wood proving more durable than anyone had expected. But it was Eleanor's voice that truly turned the tide. As the battle raged around them, she called out tactical instructions with the authority of someone who had studied warfare at her father's knee. Her suggestions guided Blackthorne's ships away from concealed gun positions, directed the stronghold's defenders toward weak points in the enemy's formation, and coordinated attacks that turned Duke Aldrich's numerical advantage into a liability. "Surrender!" Duke Aldrich shouted as his flagship began taking on water from concealed reef damage. "I am the rightful heir!" Emma stepped forward, no longer hiding behind Eleanor's skirts. In her small hands, she held the golden royal seal that proved her legitimate claim. "No, uncle, you're not." The Duke's face contorted with rage as he drew his sword, but Captain Blackthorne appeared between him and the children like an avenging angel. The clash of their blades rang across the harbor as Thomas and Emma watched their protector fight for their future. When the dust settled, Duke Aldrich knelt in defeat among the wreckage of his ambitions. His fleet was captured or destroyed, his political support crumbling as word spread of his attempt to murder royal children. The Crown recognizes Princess Emma's rightful claim, the surviving judicial officers declared, having witnessed the seal and the Duke's confession under sword point. Eleanor felt Emma's small hand slip into hers as victory settled over Tortuga's reach like morning sunlight. They had won more than a battle. They had won the right to choose their own family. 1 year later, Eleanor stood in her garden watching Thomas put the finishing touches on the new gate he had built with his own hands. The boy had grown several inches over the past months, his shoulders broadening with the confidence that came from knowing he was loved and safe. His carpentry skills, learned under the patient tutelage of Tortuga's Reach craftsmen, had blossomed into genuine artistry. "Hand me that blue ribbon, Emma," Thomas called to his sister, who was arranging decorative touches around the gate's frame. Princess Emma, though she insisted on being called simply Emma at home, carefully passed him a length of silk ribbon in royal blue. At 8 years old, she had grown into her role as both princess and daughter with equal grace, spending her mornings learning statecraft from carefully selected tutors and her afternoons helping Eleanor tend their expanded gardens. The gate itself was a masterpiece of adolescent pride and artistic vision. Thomas had carved intricate roses into the wooden frame, their petals so realistic that visiting birds occasionally mistook them for real flowers. Emma had painted delicate vines that seemed to grow naturally around her brother's carved work, and together they had created something that was both beautiful and unmistakably home. "It's perfect," Eleanor said, meaning every word. The gate would mark the entrance to the cottage that had become the official residence of the royal guardian, a position the Crown had created specifically for Eleanor after Emma's formal coronation. Captain Marcus Blackthorne emerged from the cottage carrying a tea service that still looked somewhat foreign in his weathered hands. Marriage to Eleanor had transformed the feared pirate into something unprecedented, a reformed seafarer who had traded his ship for domestic contentment and discovered he preferred this new role immensely. "The village delegation should arrive within the hour," he informed Eleanor, settling the tea set on their garden table with careful precision. The delegation was Mayor Cromwell's idea, a formal apology from Millhaven for their treatment of Eleanor throughout her unmarried years. Margaret Whitmore, now mortified by her role in Duke Aldrich's schemes, had insisted on leading the group personally to beg forgiveness. "Do you think they'll be uncomfortable?" Emma asked, her royal training making her sensitive to the complex social dynamics involved. Eleanor considered the question seriously. Perhaps. But discomfort often precedes growth, and growth is how we become better people. Thomas stepped back to admire his completed gate, its carved roses catching the afternoon sunlight. "I like that it opens both ways," he observed. "People can come in, but we can also go out whenever we want to." The symbolism was not lost on Eleanor. For 34 years, she had felt trapped behind invisible barriers of social expectation and personal doubt. Now, surrounded by her chosen family in a life she could never have imagined, those barriers had transformed into choices. Emma's laughter drew her attention to where the child was chasing butterflies among the herb garden, her movements free of the fear that had haunted her in those first dark weeks. Thomas had already moved on to planning his next project, a treehouse that would serve as both play space and emergency refuge, his protective instincts channeled into creative preparation. Marcus caught Eleanor's eye over the children's heads, his expression holding the contentment of a man who had found his true calling. Their love had bloomed slowly, built on shared purpose and mutual respect rather than passionate romance, but it had proven deeper and more satisfying than either had expected. As the afternoon sun slanted through Thomas's carved gate, Eleanor reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this moment. She had been told she would never be a mother, never be worthy of love, never belong to anything larger than her solitary existence. Those voices had been wrong about everything that mattered. The sound of approaching carriages announced the village delegation's arrival, but Eleanor felt no anxiety. Whatever apologies or explanations they brought, her real life was here, in Emma's artistic spirit, in Thomas's protective creativity, in Marcus's steady devotion, and in the garden gate that welcomed visitors while promising that this family would never again be separated. She was exactly where she belonged, surrounded by people who had chosen her as surely as she had chosen them. In the end, that was the only validation that mattered.